Hey everyone, welcome back. So we're going to go over the regulation of ovulation. So when the hypothalamus initially releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, this stimulates the anterior pituitary to release its follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones. These stimulate the ovarian follicles to wake up. So this is during that follicular phase. When those follicles wake up, they start secreting estrogens. The low level of estrogen stops, I'll say it that way, the hypothalamus from releasing more gonadotropic releasing hormone, which inhibits the anterior pituitary or stops the anterior pituitary from producing follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. The low levels of estrogen also cause the endometrial lining to start sloughing off. So arteries start to constrict, causing the uterine lining to lose blood, and that tissue starts to die off, and then that results in menstruation. Once the follicles grow to a certain size, so remember, one of those follicles is going to get nourished. The other follicles, the other of the 20 or 24 follicles that are stimulated, are just there as helpers. They start secreting higher levels of estrogen. This increased level of estrogen stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete gonadotropic releasing hormone. So low levels inhibit, but high levels activate. That stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete high levels of follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. The high levels of luteinizing hormone are going to stimulate ovulation. It's gonna activate ovulation of that one ovarian follicle that has went through meiosis 1 and is arrested in meiosis 2. The high levels of estrogen also start preparing the endometrial lining for progesterone. So this is on ovulation, day 14. Then we move to the luteal phase. So luteal phase is going to be controlled by the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts secreting progesterone as well as estrogen, but the progesterone and estrogen together inhibit gonadotropic releasing hormone, which then inhibits the anterior pituitary from releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. The corpus luteum also, the corpus luteum producing the estrogen or the progesterone moves into the endometrium and starts thickening the endometrial lining for preparation for implantation of the blastocyst. And so this is a figure from your textbook showing the ovaries, and it also shows those fallopian tubes. I told you the fallopian tubes are not attached, so right here it looks like they're attached, but you can see that they're not. But at the end we have these like finger-like projections called fimbriae that pull, they act like fingers, and they kind of pull the egg in when ovulation occurs. This leads us to the fallopian tubes, to the uterus here. At the end of the uterus is the cervical canal, and then we have the vagina. So now we're going to talk about the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes, the uterus, and vagina, okay? Oh, we've already talked about the vagina, so I don't have to, but the uterus and, so the fallopian tubes and uterus, that's it. All right, let's go on. So the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes then have three parts to them. The first part here is called the infundibulum. The end of the infundibulum, we have these tiny little fimbriae, which are like finger-like processes that pull the eggs in so that the eggs don't fall to the pelvic floor. From here, we lead to the ampulla. The ampulla Cells of the ampulla, this is the longest portion of the uterine tube, are covered in cilia. So the egg is non-motile, but the ciliated cells move, they beat that egg towards the uterus. It's in this ampulla where fertilization typically occurs. And then here at the very end, the portion of the uterine tube that actually leads to the uterus is the isthmus. The isthmus is just a very narrow region that meets with the uterus. The isthmus is actually a site where ectopic pregnancy often occurs. So we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll move into the uterus itself. So an ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that occurs outside of the uterus, okay? So typically a blastocyst will embed in the uterus in the endometrial lining. If a blastocyst can't make it to the uterus for some reason, then it can actually embed in other tissues if it's fertilized. And that causes a lot of problems because if you have an ectopic pregnancy, it's always going to lead to a miscarriage and oftentimes can also lead to loss of life of mom as well. So what you're seeing here is a tubal pregnancy. So I told you that one of the most common areas for ectopic pregnancies is when a blastocyst embeds in the isthmus of the uterine tubes. So that's a tubal pregnancy, and that's a very common, that's a very common place for ectopic pregnancies. Because the embryo cannot expand, the embryo will die. Typically around or by week 8. When the embryo dies, then this can lead to hemorrhage from mom, and it could lead to mom's death as well. So ectopic pregnancies are very dangerous. Reasons that these occur oftentimes if there's damage to the fallopian tubes. So there are certain diseases that can actually cause damage to fallopian tubes. And if you have any type of damaged tissue, that can cause the egg to not be able to move properly. If there's any blockages in the uterine tubes, that can cause the egg not to be able to move properly. And that can lead to that tubal pregnancy. Or if the egg didn't make it into the uterine tube, then that can lead to an ectopic pregnancy outside of the uterus and uterine tubes. So now let's talk about the uterus. So I showed you a picture. I'll show you another picture after I talk about the uterus. The uterus is a pear-shaped organ that has from the external environment a thick mucus plug in the inferior portion of the uterus, which is known as the cervix. So the cervix has a thick mucus plug that keeps pathogens from getting into the uterus. Pathogens can get into the vagina a lot easier because it's open to the external environment. But remember, we talked about the vaginal flora that protect the vagina from pathogens. So if we keep that vaginal flora healthy, then in general, our vagina will stay healthy as well. So the uterus is held in place by different ligaments as well as muscles of the pelvic floor. They all hold that uterine structure in the pelvic cavity. The uterus has 3 linings. The outer serosa is known as the perimetrium. Then we have the inner muscular layer. It's smooth muscle. This is the myometrium. And then I said inner, I should have said middle muscular layer. And then the innermost layer is the endometrium. This is the most Um, this is the most unique layer because it's constantly changing. So it thickens throughout that ovarian and uterine cycle, and then the endometrial lining sheds every single month from puberty until menopause, depending on the amount of different hormones in our system. So again, here's the uterus. We have the top of the uterus is known as the fundus, and then we have the body of the uterus, and then down here we have that cervical canal or the uterine isthmus, okay? And then at the very bottom is that cervix. So right here, that cervix, in the cervical canal, we have a nice thick mucus layer that protects the growing embryo from any potential damage, okay? So the uterine cycle, also known as your menstrual cycle, is a cyclical change of events in the endometrium that occurs every roughly 28 days. And again, let's assume that the cycle is 28 days. So the first 5 days would be that menstrual phase for normal menses. Then from day 6 to 14, we have the next phase, which is known as the proliferative phase. And then the last 15 to 28 would be the secretory phase. So these occur along with the ovarian cycle. So down here you can see the ovarian cycle. Up here you can see the, down here you can see the menstrual cycle, and up here you can see the ovarian cycle. So it's kind of, they work together, okay? So days 1 through 5 is the menstrual cycle. During this time, we have low levels of luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone being released. That means that we have low levels of estrogen and progesterone in our system. That low level stimulates the release of our menses, and that endometrial lining sheds off. Then we start the proliferative phase, where we start growing that tissue. So proliferative phase starts as we start increasing luteinizing hormone. So you can see luteinizing hormone starts to go up, as does the endometrial lining, and the estrogen levels increase. So here we have higher level, a spike in, that's a small spike in follicle stimulating, but a pretty high spike in luteinizing hormone, which is similar to the spike in estrogen here. All of this occurs right before ovulation, or at the end of that proliferative phase, okay? So ovulation occurs, and now we have a huge surge in progesterone, and we still have high levels of estrogen, okay? So our follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones start to dwindle, and we have higher levels of progesterone and estrogen. These are going to start dying down if the corpus luteum degrades to the corpus albicans. If fertilization occurs, that corpus luteum is going to stay active, and we're going to continue having this high level of estrogen and progesterone, which is going to keep the secretory phase high, so basically keep that uterine lining high so that we can maintain that pregnancy. All right, I'm going to stop here because it's been 14 minutes, and the last video was about 20 minutes. So, and we'll get into the breasts in our next video. Bye.